DevilNeverCry.
Final Fantasy XVI will indeed be getting a demo, and in today's video I want to go over what that demo may include. Alongside that, some new information has recently surfaced that will leave action fans very excited for Final Fantasy XVI. So at this point, it's pretty much common knowledge that Final Fantasy XVI is indeed getting a demo, and thanks to a recent interview with Famitsu, including Naoki Yoshida, Final Fantasy XVI's producer, we know that the demo is roughly stated to be available to the public around 2 weeks before the game is set to launch. In my recent preview video, where I got hands-on with Final Fantasy XVI, which you should definitely check out if you haven't already, I also made mention that a demo was coming. At the time of making that video, I couldn't necessarily confirm anything, even when comments were flooding in asking about the demo, but it seems I no longer have to, as it's now public knowledge as to what the demo is, thanks to a recent PlayStation blog, where we learned that in the public demo, which drops ahead of Final Fantasy XVI's launch on June 22nd, players will be able to experience the opening hours of Final Fantasy XVI as they play through Clive Rosfield, the protagonist's youth, and essentially the events that set the rest of Final Fantasy XVI in motion. Going one step further, thanks to a recent interview conducted by Primal Liquid, a fellow content creator, that featured Naoki Yoshida, the producer of FF16, the localization director Koji Fox, and the art director Minagawa-san, we know that you'll be able to carry over your save data from the demo over to the full game if you decide to purchase it. The idea of carrying your save data over isn't something that's necessarily new, but it definitely is welcome, and it's a tactic that Square Enix have started doing amongst a myriad of their games, not just with Final Fantasy XVI. And to reiterate what I said in my second preview video for FF16, this game has a fantastically strong introduction sequence, one that I think is quite well paced, that serves to set up the main characters or the key characters to the story quite well, and it features a fair amount of combat in there to get you somewhat to grips with the basics of the game, and I think for all of those reasons I am very much interested in seeing what other people's thoughts are when finally being able to get hands-on with this game. With the demo out of the way, now it's time to dive into some truly juicy details about Final Fantasy XVI's extra modes that you might want to pay attention to if you are a fan of the combat or just challenging games in general. Thanks to a recent interview held by Game Informer featuring the game's combat director Ryota Suzuki of DMC, Marvel vs. Capcom 2 and Dragon's Dogma fame, we learned multiple things. The first of which is that yes, Final Fantasy XVI will indeed feature an arcade mode that will allow players to run through stages that they've already completed, but this time with the addition of an on-screen score or ranking calculator and combat grader. How exactly the ranking system or score calculation works we're unsure of at the moment, but you can rest assured I'll be covering these features in depth upon launch. Continuing in the interview, we also come to learn that New Game Plus will actually open up 2 additional versions of the arcade mode that are both of course more difficult than the game's base story and action mode difficulties. New Game Plus works as expected, where you'll be able to play from the beginning of FF16 with all of your previously unlocked abilities and gear available right from the get-go. Suzuki-san also goes on to clarify that if there are any treasures, gear or PlayStation trophies that you might have missed the first time round, then you'll be able to get these through the stage replay feature instead of having to wait for another playthrough. Going back to difficulty, however, the first one that they highlight is the Final Fantasy mode, which I've covered in previous videos, but just to reiterate, this mode will actually increase the game's difficulty, change the monster placement that you may come across throughout the game, and will remix whichever enemies will appear in certain combat encounters. If you've played any previous DevilNeverCry games or Bayonetta games on some of the harder difficulties, all of this will sound quite familiar. The reason that they focused so hard on combat with these extra difficulties pertains to the main design philosophy they had when going about the creation of Final Fantasy XVI, where Suzuki-san states that the first playthrough is ideally learning about Clive, learning the controls, getting accustomed to them, and then also enjoying the story of Final Fantasy XVI, where the second playthrough is geared towards shifting that focus away from the story and more towards the action. Further ahead in this interview, Suzuki-san also makes mention of the ARETE stone in the Hideaway, which simply is a stone that Clive can interact with, which will take Clive into a special training area, which will allow him to practice and wail on specific enemies to his heart's content, allowing you to test out moves and combos and gear and all sorts of things to allow you to fine-tweak your combat experience. Alongside that, the ARETE stone also serves another purpose. By interacting with this stone in the hideaway on the Final Fantasy mode in a New Game Plus playthrough, you'll be able to take on stages in arcade mode on an even higher difficulty, as I've previously talked about, titled the Ultimaniac mode. And best of all, of course, the arcade modes will actually have a global leaderboard attached to them, allowing you to see how your performance stacks up against fellow Final Fantasy fans. This next quote from Suzuki-san, to be honest, sounds like music to my ears, where he goes on to once more state, "These modes were pretty much created solely for the hardcore players, those players that happen to pride themselves on their skills in action games. It's a challenge that, even for them, is going to be very difficult to complete." As someone who's been a long-time fan of Final Fantasy, and someone who enjoys playing tough action games like Ninja Gaiden, God Hand, and DMC to name a few, this sounds right up my alley, and you can rest assured I'll be streaming a lot of this, as I did with DMC 5, as I suffered through platinuming that game twice live on stream, much to the amusement of many viewers. Shifting the discussion away from difficulty for a second, we have some more information on New Game Plus that pertains to weapons and accessories. You'll be able to upgrade your weapons further beyond what you'd be capable of doing in an initial playthrough, and you can also upgrade accessories in New Game Plus, which you weren't able to do in New Game. Which, if these new modes weren't enough to convince you to play the game through a second time, perhaps these new incentives might sweeten that deal. And then we come to the introduction of the CHRONOLITH trials. Hiroshi Takai, the director of FF16, goes on to describe the trials as the most difficult challenge in Final Fantasy XVI, where these trials consist of multiple stages, each with 4 rounds of enemies. The first 3 rounds will consist of standard waves of monsters, which will increase in difficulty as you progress, with the 4th round being a boss. These CHRONOLITH trials are timed, and every stage will consist of a list of moves, combos and objectives that you'll be able to execute to gain more time. However, pulling these off apparently will not be easy, as you won't be able to heal whatsoever in these trials, with the only way of recovering health being the activation of a limit break move. That sentence there, of course, also implies that there will be more than one limit break move available that Clive can use, which most of us pretty much suspected at this point, I believe. But coming back to the trials, it seems that each one will be based off of a specific icon, where Game Informer goes on to clarify that they watched Hiroshi Takai and Ryota Suzuki actually play through the Phoenix trial, where they only had access to Phoenix's iconic abilities, which essentially forces them to play to a certain playstyle and have to adapt to whatever abilities they have on hand, as opposed to your standard bread and butter that you might have been mixing throughout your normal playthrough of the game. I know that people call this game Devil May Clive or EIKON Must Die, jokingly and endearingly at that, but it seems as though Square Enix really have taken more than just a few pages from the book of DMC with some of the things that they've gone on to describe here. Not that I find that to be a detriment at all. I know some people are quite mixed on whether or not, the direction that this game is taking is right for Final Fantasy XVI, but to be honest, if they're going to go action, they might as well go hard and do it right, and it seems as though that's exactly what they're doing with this. Though I am curious to know what your thoughts are, so as always, let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and whether or not this seems like it's something you'd be interested in. With all that said and done though, it has been me, DevilNeverCry. I'd like to thank all of you for watching, and as always, I'll see you all next video.